Hi, everyone. Thank you very much for joining today. I'm really excited to showcase some of the work that my colleague, Dr. Xiaowei Tsai, and myself have been working on for the last year or so. It's funded from the USDA Economic Research Service, and it's kind of a long-run project trying to measure when the pandemic hit, what happened to the food supply chain, what happened to food access and food prices and food purchases, with the long-term goal of trying to have a food supply chain that's kind of more resilient the next time we get hit hard. So with that, I really want to turn things over to the students. This is their show. So thank you all very much for tuning in. I appreciate it.
Awesome. Good morning, everyone. Like Dr. Volpe said, thank you for having us. Let me just get this, share my screen with everyone. Awesome. So today we will be presenting on inventory levels, shopping baskets, food prices during peak food at home demand periods. Like Dr. Volpe said, this is a cooperative agreement funded by the USDA Economic Research Service. And this presentation was made by and with the help of Dr. Richard Volpe, Dr. Xiaowei Tsai, Maxine McFessel, myself, Camille Hardiker, and Katie Denise. Just a quick disclaimer that the view in this presentation are those of the authors and do not reflect the USDA or the ERS. So the long-term project objectives are to identify retail food stockouts and shortages and develop a data set of their locations and magnitudes, as well as to identify price impacts of the pandemic and related food shortages. Lastly, another goal is to measure potential food access impacts of the pandemic. So this is all necessary because traditional food scanner data does not provide information on food stockouts or shortages. Therefore, the research team presenting today are engaged in efforts that will help identify such stockouts and shortages. So I will be presenting today on behalf of the database team, which consists of myself and Rona Haworth. So some of our objectives and main tasks were to find and analyze data to aid in measuring and identifying food shortages due to COVID, changes in transportation capacity, specifically barges and trucks, as well as wage data on a county level, and how other factors might affect food shortages other than COVID-19. So we used a variety of publicly available information from numerous sources. Most of the federal data sets we used are from the USDA and the BLS. And the following slides all show examples of insights related to the pandemic that we have drawn from this publicly available data. So when restaurants and bars closed, food spending in the US shifted dramatically towards supermarkets, which contributed to shortages and stockouts in the early months of the pandemic. Compared to 1 year prior, many food prices increased sharply during the onset of the pandemic. Meat production was particularly problematic, and large quantities of fruits and vegetables were wasted, and this led to particularly high food prices for these specific food groups. There are many costs affecting the food supply chain, which rose during the pandemic, but by varying degrees. So once again, we see that animal processing and meat production were hit very hard early on in the pandemic. Food at home and grocery prices saw their biggest 1 month increase in over 30 years in April of 2020. And then this slide and the next touch on the transportation industry, the trucking industry in particular, which faced significant problems even before the pandemic, mainly due to driver shortages. These slides show that since COVID-19 began, truck rates have been trending up while truck availability has been trending down. This has certainly contributed to food price increases and food shortages in the last year. So some of the key findings Rona and I found were numerous data sets found describing various commodity availability, transportation availability, producer price index for various commodities and changes by month, data specific to COVID-19, which was awesome, weekly advertised fruit and vegetable retail prices by region, including the number of stores that stock the commodity, the units sold, and the variety. And there is currently acquisition underway in collaboration with the USDA and the ERS for some of the data sets listed in the previous slides. Next, I would love to introduce the news team, and Camille Hardiker will be speaking on behalf of them.
Hello, my name is Camille Hardiker, and I work alongside Joe Shea and Haley Powell on the news team. We help identify where shortages happen through popular press postings an effort to help the entire team find the food shortage data not recorded by scanner data. We collected public information to understand what food and beverage products and regions saw the most shortages during the pandemic, as well as what the main reasons were for these shortages. Our data was pulled through Google searches using key search terms, social media posts, and online videos before being sorted and analyzed. Here we have a list of resources that we have used throughout our research process. These include digital newspapers, local and national news clips, social media, and academic journals. We collected 254 different food and beverage entries and broke them down into 8 categories: meat products, fresh and frozen produce, dairy, grains and beans, beverages, baking products, canned products, and snack foods. We found that meat products were by far the most affected group. Here we have a breakdown of each category and the product shortages that make them up. You can see that fresh products like chicken and poultry, milk, and fresh produce were affected the most in these categories, along with bread. Here we have the last 3 categories, and you can see that milk, flour, and canned vegetables are by far the most affected products for these 3 categories. We looked at these shortages across the United States as a whole, but also on a smaller regional level, breaking the United States into 4 regions: South, West, Midwest, and East. As you can see here, meat products were by far the highest shortage across the United States. As you can see in these graphs, the Western and Southern regions, there were no baking product shortages, while there were no beverage shortages in the Eastern regions and no dairy shortages in the Midwest regions. In all the regions, we can see a high number of meat shortages, along with grains and beans shortages in the West. We found that there were 3 main reasons behind the pandemic-related shortages: production shutdown, consumer panic, and specialized supply chain. As shown here, most shortages were due to consumer panic. In this graph, we can see that grains and beans categories were not affected by production shutdowns, while meat products were affected the most. Here we can see that although all categories were affected by consumer panic, meat products suffered the greatest shortages and snack foods experienced almost none. And lastly, we can see again that all categories were affected by specialized supply chain. However, both meat products and fresh and frozen produce were affected the greatest. Now I would like to introduce Katie, who will speak about the Trends team's findings.
Hi, my name is Katie Denise, and I work alongside Amber Ecker on the Google Trends team. So real quickly, what is Google Trends? Google Trends is a website hosted by Google that allows users to view the popularity of various search queries from Google search in either a geographic data set or a time series data set. For the purpose of this project, we specifically looked at these time series data sets. So how we developed our search queries is we aggregated the search terms from the commonly found products in the news team's search. And the list of those queries that we used, all 22 of them are on the right side of the screen. And we specifically use those terms to look into the top 34 metropolitan statistical areas across the United States in the time frame of 6 months before the 2020 COVID-19 pandemic up until October 31st, 2020. So we looked at about a year's worth of data across these search queries and these metropolitan statistical areas. And the changes of popularity of a search term could imply that there was a food shortage in a particular metropolitan statistical area. Next slide, please. So here's an example of a data set that we would pull from Google Trends. It is an example of the popularity of the query flour in the Detroit metropolitan statistical area during our specified time period. We can see that our peak is March 29th, 2020, and it's a 60% increase in popularity compared to that week prior. So it indicates that consumers in Detroit may have been worried about flour during this point in time. And we can see that the changes after this peak date are nowhere near as low as it was pre-pandemic. Next slide, please. So after we collected all of these individual search terms, we conducted cross-city comparisons among groupings of different metropolitan statistical areas. With Google Trends, we were only allowed to group 5 different MSAs at a certain point. So that's what we did here. This is an example of using the query flower against Orlando, Sacramento, Columbus, Detroit, and Dallas. In the last slide, we looked at Detroit specifically, and we saw that the peak date was March 29th, 2020. That hasn't changed in this data set, but what Google Trends does with when you group different queries is it scales the data against the search query that was searched the most popularly. So here we can see that among this grouping, Sacramento, those in Sacramento searched flower more frequently than compared to the other those who searched flower in those other 4 MSAs. So we can see that those in Sacramento searched flower almost 25% more than those did in Detroit in that same time frame. These data sets also show the grouping of our peak dates. So it also helps indicate and show more information that there may have been a nationwide shortage during this time. Next slide, please. So after you did that, we also looked at the average change in search intensity 3 months post-peak. Larger numbers could indicate that there was a shortage in that MSA at a certain point. Smaller numbers could indicate that there was not a shortage or that there's still an ongoing shortage of that product. So here we've highlighted the largest changes. So in Pittsburgh and Cincinnati, searchers may have been concerned about eggs, while Sacramento, those in Sacramento were concerned about flower at some point. Next slide. Here we've highlighted the lowest points. So we see that in Portland, Las Vegas, Austin, and Cincinnati, there were there was very little change in the search intensity for milk. And for Las Vegas and Cincinnati, there was very little change in the search for flower. Next slide. Here I've highlighted just a certain term. We see that with eggs, these show the largest changes in search intensity. So it could indicate that among this grouping of MSAs, for example, that there was a nationwide shortage of eggs. Next slide. And here we see that with flower, that isn't necessarily the case. With Portland, Sacramento, and Pittsburgh, those changes were much greater than they were in Las Vegas, Austin, and Cincinnati. Next slide. Thank you. And here we're just looking specifically at Sacramento. We see that those in Sacramento, searchers in Sacramento may have been more concerned about eggs and flour than they were about milk and bread. So in closing, the data, there was a wealth of information presented here today, and the data and information presented all help to give insight into the scanner data to aid in Dr. Volpe and Dr. Tsai's research. So we thank you all for listening. Are there any questions?
Thank you. That was a great presentation, and it's very thorough. It's looking at all aspects of food pricing, food chain, looking at cities. What great work, Dr. Volpe and students, and it's awesome. So what questions? We have a few minutes here. Who has a question or comment? I mean, I have a question. Mine's a very basic question, and then I guess maybe this was for the second student that presented. Was that Camille? What is consumer panic? Does that mean that people are just buying a ton of it? Is that what that means? They're just buying it?
Yeah, so basically we define consumer panic as people going to the store panicking that food was going to run out and just buying as much as they could get their hands on.
So that was that the issue with like the toilet paper in the first beginning?
Exactly. Yeah.
And that was also for meat products too, or I was a little confused, or is it the supply chain? There was issues with that too, both?
We found that definitely consumer panic affected meat shortages. I think meat shortages were also affected by kind of all three. So consumer panic, specialized supply chain, and then also production shutdown. So many of the meat processing facilities had to shut down early in the process due to COVID outbreaks, which then in turn slowed down the production and created a shortage of meat products that became available.